So welcome to Tyburn Convent for the second of a series of 4 talks on the Martyrs. Our talks are free, but we are accepting donations at the end of the talk. Today is a very special day. It's the 102nd anniversary of the death of Blessed Mother Marie Adele, the foundress of this Benedictine community. Her mortal remains lie nearby this chapel and may be visited by all the faithful for veneration. Mother General is going to start us off this evening with an update on the cause of her canonization. Our main speaker tonight is Tom Henry, affectionately known as Tyburn Tom. He will be familiar to many of you. A Londoner, a cabby driver. He became interested in Tyburn Convent about a decade ago or so, and has since been assiduously studying the lives of the martyrs of the Reformation. His videos of the Tyburn martyrs are available again on the YouTube Tyburn Nuns channel. So there's a lot more information out there than we'll hear tonight, but it's already available online for you. In our first talk in this series, Tom spoke about this place and why Tyburn is so special. Tonight, Tom is widening the scope, and he's looking at the London sites where Catholics met their martyrdom. Places that many of us will have known, have walked by many times perhaps, but not with the awareness of the deep and rich Catholic histories of these locales. In fact, Tom took our prayer group, the prayer group Holy Spirit to the Senegal to the Holy Spirit, which is the group that has started these talks, we've organized them. He took all of our group to these places. There were many things that were amazing about that tour, but in particular, the sense of place and how important that is. I think about the history of Christianity. Christ was a real person who really lived and died in a real place. And that helps us to strengthen our faith. And so also when we think of the martyrs, they were real people in real places where they lived and died and fought the good fight. And that also strengthens us. One of the things that I love about Edward Campion is when he came back from being ordained a priest on the continent, he passed by here and he said, "This will be the place of my final battle." Very powerful. So of course, the idea that we have in our prayer group is to have these talks because we want more and more Londoners to know and love the martyrs. But I think I can speak for all of us in the group when I say that we all know that our world is not in a good spiritual condition, and that the values and beliefs that Christians hold dear are mocked and derided all around us. So we hope that the lives of the martyrs that you're going to hear about today, men and women who lived all over London, will inspire you, knowing that spiritually they are still present to us, encouraging us in our fight, knowing what we are facing in our daily lives, at home and at work, just as they face their own battles for God in their own places in their own day. Mother General, to give you our update on the canonization process, and then Tom will follow.
Thank you. Cause of canonization. So our mother foundress, whose anniversary of death is today, is a servant of God. So her cause is open, and that happened 10 years ago. I remember because it came the day after my election as Mother General. So it's something that was a big blessing. We have had a lot of favours received, that's what we can call them, because the church declares anything as, it's up to the church to declare something as a miracle. So I'm not telling you a miracle, I'm just telling you a favour received, which I think, it's my personal opinion that it is supernatural. But that's just my personal opinion. It's for the church to judge. Now this happened only just recently, on the 8th of March, was landing in Rome. I was just being driven from the airport to what used to be our monastery there. It's currently closed. And I had a message from one of our monasteries. And she said, it was over in Latin America, and the message was that there was this lady who had stage 4 lymphatic cancer. Now I think it's lymphatic cancer, but my translation of the Spanish could be wrong. But anyway, she was given just a couple of weeks to live. And she came to our monastery and asked to see one of the nuns. It was our Mother Rosa who she saw. And Mother Rosa gave her a prayer card. It's the same one which we would like to hand out after the talk. It's a prayer for canonization of Mother Founders. So it was the same one. And we have it in Spanish too. And this lady took the prayer card home and prayed, and she immediately felt better. She felt better. Now her children got worried about her, so they booked an appointment with the GP. And the GP organised some examinations done, and all the examinations said she was completely cancer-free. And she was at the last stages of cancer, stage 4. She was given only a few weeks to live. So that was on the 8th of March this year. Now, the interesting thing is I was over in Rome to try and organise for the commission, and currently it's at the diocesan stage. Monsignor Tasciotti is in charge of the commission. Monsignor Tasciotti works for the Congregation of the Dicastery of Saints in Rome, and he was the judge on the cause of canonization of St. Carlos Acutis. He was the judge that decided that St. Carlos Acutis was a saint. So he's very experienced. He also was a friend of Padre Pio. So he's a lovely Monsignor, but he's elderly now and infirmed. So the next stage for the cause is to take the commission to Setura, which is why I've got Mother here. Setura is in Peru, and to Ecuador, where the favor received happened, and also to Colombia. Mother Nicholas here is the biggest promoter of our Mother Founders, as she was in Peru for 44 years. Mother, do you think that Mother Founders should be canonized?
Yes. Everything about her life, Mother, is so spiritual, and since she became she entered as a nun, and she has renovado totalmente our congregation, and her enseñanzas of us, all of us in the congregation, is marvelous, Mother. And she is so simple and full of wisdom, but there is nothing in her that I would say is against her canonization, because she is all her life, Mother. She has been fixed on God, and I'm always praying for her. Every day, everything goes all right.
Mother speaks English. Anyway, so we've got more information. So if you want to come and see Mother Nicholas, probably if you're interested in helping the cause or praying for the prayer of canonization, that prayer card will be handed out at the back. We also have a leaflet, and if you can help us a little bit also to send the commission over to Latin America, we'd be very grateful. I'm sorry to do this. I don't normally, I'm a bit embarrassed about it, but we love our mother foundress, and we think that she's I think she's a doctor of the church personally. I think she is a very big saint. I know how powerful it is. I know how powerful her prayers are. I've seen so many things that have happened. Father Barry, also our former chaplain, he swears by her. I don't know if you're not supposed to swear according to the Bible, but he does, she's the first go-to saint of him as well. So if you know Father Barry. All right, Tom, I'm going. Thank you very much.
Without further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me to welcome Tom Henry.
Right. Good evening to you all.
Good evening.
Welcome to this session of the Martyrs in London. I'm going to go through tonight what may seem a lot of facts and figures, people, or whatever. Don't worry. Don't worry. There's no questions afterwards. We're not going to test you. Just sit back and let it all come in. Okay? At the end of the evening, as you leave, you will be given one of these. It's a card, and on it are all the martyr sites in London, or most of them. And the martyrs have actually died there. So please take one of those with you and use it for your knowledge. Because a lot of people don't know about the martyrs. If you go home and look at one or two of these and decide, I'm going to find out a bit more about this guy, that's a success. That's a success. And I hope you all do it. And something like this, you can organise in your parish a little pilgrimage to the various sites mentioned on here, and pay homage to the martyrs who are linked to these sites. Okay? We'll start off with a prayer. And it's a prayer of a martyr that very few people know about. And I'll just spend a couple of seconds afterwards telling you a bit more about this saint. Blessed Margaret Pole, faithful daughter of the Church and courageous witness to Christ, I turn to you today in my time of need. You who endured unjust imprisonment, the loss of loved ones, and the threat of earthly powers, with steadfast faith and integrity. Pray for me that I may remain firm in my beliefs, no matter the trials I face. Help me to respond to hardship with grace and to always act with integrity. Obtain for me the courage to stand up for what is true and to trust in God's love even when it is difficult. Amen.
Amen.
If you know a bit about this woman's life, you'd understand why she wrote a prayer like that. Just very, very briefly. Believe it, she was a princess. She was a true princess. She had two uncles, Edward IV and Richard III. Her own father came between those two, and he died a very violent death. His elder brother, Edward IV, ordered him to be murdered in the Tower of London, and it was a really extraordinary death because he was drowned in a barrel of wine. Okay? That's the background we have for her. Her brother was also executed. She had 5 children. The eldest son was also executed. Her younger son went to Rome, fled to Rome, and became a cardinal there. And he was known as Cardinal Reginald Pole, and he returned to England during the time of Queen Mary to set up the Catholic Church here in England. That's all I'm going to say. The rest, hopefully, will lead you to find out more about this extraordinary woman and the extraordinary times that she lived in. Okay? Right. Moving on. As I say, do not worry at all if you find that you can't remember everything. Hopefully you remember something. There were some things you will remember. Right, here we see an ancient map of London. It's round about the 1600s, okay? And just to give you a bit of an idea, this is Fleet Street. And you get all the way up to Fleet Street, you go Ludgate Hill, and here is St. Paul's. Okay, dominating the whole horizon. If you go up there, you come to places like Charterhouse and Smithfield here. If you go west a bit, and we go right to the west here, you come down Bishopsgate to London Bridge. London Bridge was very, very important. It was the only bridge across the Thames. The next bridge was 13 miles away. And so what happened, you had this very busy traffic going across the river by boatmen. And if you wanted to get to Whitehall, you went by boat all the way around to Westminster. London Bridge was not a bridge as we would see it today. London Bridge was a place where people lived, worked, traded, everything like that. It was not a thoroughfare as such as we would see it. And at the entrance to it, people who had been executed, their heads were impaled on the southern part of London Bridge as a warning for people coming into the city. In other words, behave or else. Now you're all probably familiar with this, hopefully you are. This is the plaque in the ground that you see on the traffic island in Marble Arch. The thing about this, the Tyburn tree was a very relatively new contraption. Before the Tyburn tree came along, and it was in 1571 when it was erected, people or convicts were just hung from a crossbeam. The rope was tied to the crossbeam, they were on a cart, the cart was drawn slowly away, they dropped and dangled. Unlike hangings in the so-called modern era, there was no big drop. Because when people are hung today, or used to be in the relative past, and there was a big drop, it broke their neck, they died instantly. When the cart was drawn away, they were left to dangle. And sometimes it would take 10, 15 minutes, perhaps even longer, for them to die. Now, a lot of people think that the first martyr at Tyburn was Edmund Campion. That isn't true. The Jesuits only came to England in 1580. In 1576, a layman called John Story, who was a lawyer, was the first Catholic to be hung, drawn and quartered at Tyburn. And there were a few others before Edmund Campion came along. There we see somebody quite nicely put some chairs there. I don't know if they are planning permission or whatever, but what it has done, people used to walk over the stones, not thinking of what was there or any significance that it had. But by putting these chairs here, people now tend to go around it. And if you actually look at those trees there, one, two, three, they would represent the tripod, the three supporting beams of the Tyburn tree. And the reason they had this Tyburn tree was protection. With the Tyburn tree, you could kill or hang 24 people at once. 24. 8 across each beam. It was only used to its fullest extent twice in the 17th century. But we don't walk over it anymore. People sometimes will sit there and pray. And if you ever pass by, that's what we should do. Now, if we move along Oxford Street, and you come to the corner of Tottenham Court Road. There's a church there called St. Giles in the Fields. It's a pretty great building, and it's covered with lots of trees and grass around the area, which is very, very unique, because as you can appreciate, the land is very valuable in that part of the world. But in that church, you'll see this stone, this plaque, and it's to remember 6 Jesuits who died in 1679, and Oliver Plunkett. Now, if you look at that 1679, as a historian, it tells you something. 1679, a Catholic dying, you think of Titus Oates. I don't know if the name means anything to you, but Titus Oates, I suppose we call him, was an inveterate liar with a pathological hatred of Catholics. He went abroad, he was an Anglican, a Baptist, he went abroad, became a Catholic, said he became a Catholic, failed to become a Catholic, entered the seminary, and was thrown out of the seminary. Now, the chap who threw him out was this chap called Thomas Whitbread, who was the rector of the seminary at the time. Now, when Titus Oates came back to England, he had all the ammunition ready to start spreading news and propaganda about the Jesuits, about the Catholics, and how they were going to kill the king. And because of his lies, about 20 Catholics were executed over the course of the 3 years. He had this pathological hatred for Catholics. But what happened was that all these bodies were removed in 1863. They went to, I think it was St. Pancras Cemetery in North London. But when Oliver Plunkett was buried, he was buried in 2 tin boxes, because he was actually hung, drawn and quartered. The rest of them were just hung. Charles II knew that Titus Oates was telling a load of lies, and he did not want these people to suffer unnecessarily. However, there was very little he could do. There was a terrific tension between Parliament and the King. Parliament was full of Puritans. The King had this leaning towards the Catholics. He had a Catholic wife, Catherine of Braganza, and so there was this terrific tension that he found himself in. Did he go with the Puritans? Did he support the Catholics, which was his natural instinct? So these were all hung, but they weren't hung, drawn and quartered. Oliver Plunkett was hung, drawn and quartered, and buried in 2 tin boxes. And on top of him, they buried this other lady in later years, and then they secretly removed him, and his remains were initially sent back to Germany, to a Benedictine monastery in Germany, because before he died, Oliver Plunkett associated himself with the Benedictines. This picture over here is all about the Benedictine martyrs, and in the corner you will see Oliver Plunkett. He had this great aspiration to become a Benedictine. Right, now we're moving on. What you see before you now is a picture of the palace of the Bishop of Ely. In those days, bishops came to London to advise the king. And we have to remember at that time that the bishops were both lords temporal and lords spiritual. So when they came to London, they needed a place to stay. And the Bishop of Ely built this magnificent palace. Now, there are only 2 remains of this palace. One is the chapel, and the other I'll show you as well. I'll keep it in suspense, you'll never guess what it is. This is Ely Place today. Ely Place, because it was Ely Palace. So it's called Eli Place. And along this road, see, the church is along here, you wouldn't see it. There's also a pub along here, which is hidden as well. Okay. But if we proceed further, this is St. Etheldreda's church. Now, it was named St. Etheldreda because St. Etheldreda was honoured very much in Ely. They had a big church there in her name. And so when the bishop came here, he called this church St. Etheldreda's. Etheldreda was a Saxon princess in the 6th century, born about 640. She then went and got married to this chap called Tyburn. After a couple of years, he died. But the one thing about her marriage was she only got married under one condition, that she could remain chaste. So he died, and then she married again. And she married the son of the king of Northumberland, called Egfrid. They got on the same, and they got married under the same circumstances. But a few years later, he was looking for his conjugal rights. And so she decided no. So she went back to Ely. She built 2 monasteries there, one for monks and one for nuns. And she died there. When she died, they buried her in the Fens. You know, it's a very marshy part of the country, the Fens. And her sister, called Saxburger, became the prioress there. And 15 years later, she dug up the body and found it was intact. Now, when Etheldreda had died, she had this great growth of cancer on her neck. That had totally disappeared. So what they did was, they then built a cathedral and they put her body in a shrine inside the cathedral. And pilgrims came from all over in the Middle Ages to venerate it. However, during the Reformation, it was destroyed. So it's not there any longer. Right, now, for me, this whole building, this whole church, if there was a DNA in a building, the DNA in this building would be martyrdom. Here you have a simple map, and right in the middle there is St. Etheldreda's. All around it, if you can see those red spots, all around it are execution sites and prisons. Up here you've got Clerkenwell Green, you come down there to Charterhouse, you come to Smithfield, you get to Smithfield Newgate Prison, Bridewell Prison, junctions of main roads where people were executed. So right at the centre of all these places of execution and martyrdom is St. Etheldreda's. Right, if you go into St. Etheldreda's and you go along the corridor, that's the sort of scene you'll find. And if you proceed further down, you come to stairs, going down into the crypt. And then you go into the crypt. You see, it's a social area, which is quite appropriate, because when the church was built, the crypt was the tavern. There was a tavern underneath the church. And when the people were in the tavern and had all this carousing going on, it would seep up through the rafters, and people would hear it in church. But that is what it is. Now, there's a strange one, that. It's a floor. People often take pictures of floors, except me. And I took that because it was a tavern. During the Second World War, it was a bomb shelter. But in the 1600s, it became a cemetery. The history behind this church is that in 1874, it came into the Catholics' hands again. They got it at an auction by mistake, to be honest, but it was theirs, they held on to it. And when they started renovating it, and they dug up the floor there, they found these bones. And they realised about where one of the bodies was actually buried, it was a priest. And the only explanation that anybody could think of was an event that happened in 1623. Now, it happened at the French ambassador's residence. Now, even though there was a persecution of the Catholics, embassies had diplomatic immunity, as they do today. And the embassy was allowed to have priests, which was great for Catholics, because often Catholics would go to the embassy and have mass or whatever was going on there. But on this particular Sunday, there were 2 Jesuits in the French ambassador's house, and they were going to have a devotions afternoon. And what they did was going to compose of Vespers, a talk, and other devotions as well. And believe it or not, the word got around. And 200 to 300 Catholics turned up. Don't forget, they were being persecuted openly. They turned up to go to the French ambassador's house for this afternoon of devotions. But because there were so many of them, and they all went to the top of the building collapsed. The building collapsed. Almost 100 were killed. And the Bishop of London, a chap called George Montaigne, said, right, these are Catholics. They're not going to have a public burial because they're Catholics. Not even second-class citizens, they're Catholics. And what they did was they dug 2 huge pits and just threw the bodies into the pits and covered them over. Except for 18. At that time, because they were trying to negotiate a marriage between James I's son, Charles, who became Charles I, and the Infanta in Spain, the Spanish ambassador was staying at Ely Palace. So he went down there and he took 18 bodies and brought them back to Ely Palace, and he buried them in that crypt. And it's often known as the event of the Sorrowful Vespers, or the Doleful Vespers. Now, if you go up further into the church, you come across this. This is the royal coat of arms. And that used to be in the church. But when the Catholics took it over, they removed it, because basically, that being in the church meant the king or the monarch is in charge here. By taking it out, the Catholics reminded everybody the Pope is in charge here. So it was moved out. And if you go now into the church itself, you first come across this huge stained glass window. This is the largest stained glass window in London. And when you think of places like St. Paul's, Westminster Abbey, Westminster Cathedral, there's both the Southern cathedrals, this is the largest stained glass window in London. On the right there you will see scenes of martyrdom, people being executed. Here you have Christ and his passion. And here you have the first 5 martyrs, martyred at Tyburn in 1535, 4th of May, and the 3 Carthusians are there. And from that, although it's a bit of an anachronism, it didn't exist at that time. You have an outline of the Tyburn tree, and of course Christ in the middle there. But this was donated to the church by the French, Spanish, German and Italian embassies. They all got together. And it was given to the church in 1964. And although you can't see it yet, if you go to if you see the very top of it, you'd find the coat of arms of John the 23rd, because it was during his papacy that this window was given to the church. Right, this is when you go into the church, this is what you see. And when they renovated the church, they renovated it back to the original as best they possibly can. So when you see these beams here, that is how it would have looked originally. And the whole thing is dominated by these 8 statues. Now, the thing about these statues, they all represent people who lived within the confines of the parish of St. Ethelreda. And the other thing they had in common is that they're all martyrs. And to be quite honest, none of them knew each other. None of them knew each other. They have a lifespan of about 70 years, but they never knew each other. And if you can see there, the little corner there, there's a little box. This is what it is. This is a casket. And inside that casket is the remains of a hand of St. Ethelreda. And it was given to the church when it was consecrated in 1878 by the Duke of Norfolk. Now, if I was to go to the Duke of Norfolk, I'd keep you here all night. We'll meet him in other parts of our journey as well. But he was a Catholic. And we come from his son was St. Philip Howard. But that's further on in our journey. But we continue. Now, the first statue you come across is this guy called Edmund Jones. People aren't sure if it's Edmund or Edward because the priests often changed their names. They were in disguise, they weren't supposed to be there, so they changed their names. But it was either Edmund or Edward. And he came from Wales. And he lived just off Fleet Street in a place called Shoe Lane. And he was caught by the priest hunters. And what happened was that he lived in a grocer's shop. And they set up a scaffold in about 1590, it would have been. And they hung, drawn and quartered him outside the shop. And you'll find that this has been happening more often. And it was done to really scare people when they saw this happening. But that was what he did. A young guy from Wales, but he was hung, drawn and quartered in Fleet Street outside the grocer's shop. Here we have him again. This guy is John Roach, Irishman. Sister Carla is laughing. He was an Irishman. He was a boatman, a simple boatman. He would, as I mentioned before, he would cross the river carrying people or goods or whatever. And he got involved, we'll see here in a minute, with Margaret Ward. Margaret Ward was planning to rescue a priest from the Bridewell prison. And she sort of commandeered his services. Apparently the guy who was supposed to help her let her down at the last minute, and she commandeered his services. So he came with this boat, and she provided the rope, but unfortunately the rope was too small, too short. And the priest had to jump the last distance, whatever it was, and he injured himself. But the priest managed to get away, but this guy was caught. And we'll move on a minute because this is Anne Line. Anne Line, it's funny, a lot of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales were converts. But a lot of them were converts. She was brought up as a Calvinist, and she had a brother called William, and she married a guy called Roger Lyne. Now, she became a Catholic with William, and when she did so, her father disinherited her. So what happened, she then married a guy called Roger Lyne. Roger Lyne came from a family of recusants. Now, recusants were Catholics who refused to go to the Anglican services in the Anglican Church. And they were fined heavily for it. I think if you didn't go, and it was every week, every Sunday, you were fined £20, which was about the 2 years of wages for an unskilled worker. So you can imagine week after week after week after week. And most of these people, these recusants, died in abject poverty. But the other thing about her, is that she was, Roger Lyne was caught with William attending a mass. They were thrown into prison, and Roger Lyne went to Bridewell, which was a real hellhole, where they had public floggings, and the treadmill was in operation. But Roger Lyne was deported, and his family said to him, unless you change your beliefs, we will disinherit you. So he went abroad to Flanders, and shortly after that, he died. Now she was there in England, alone, no means of support. Along came Father John Gerard. Have you ever heard of Father John Gerard? Yeah. He was quite a famous Jesuit at the time. We don't know much about him for the simple reason he was never martyred. He was never martyred. If you were martyred, we'd have known all about you. But he was never martyred. But he did live his life is the stuff of a Netflix or a Hollywood blockbuster, to be quite honest. He was put in 3 prisons: Bridewell, the Cling Street, and then the Tower of London. He escaped from the Tower of London. He made 2 attempts, and he escaped from the Tower of London. And one of the things he did for Anne Lyne, he asked her to look after a house for priests to keep them safe. And when he escaped from the tower, he went to one of her houses and then on from there to other things. But he eventually left the country disguised as a servant of the Spanish ambassador. But it's a really good story if you ever get to read it about John Gerard. She was caught. It was Michaelmas, or Candlemas rather. A lot of people were going into a house. Now, one of the things about a totalitarian state, you think of George Orwell and places like that. First of all, people were put in prison without any trial. Prison, no trial, in prison. And the second thing was, they had a terrific spy network. The Elizabethans had a terrific spy network. Very, very good. They had spies everywhere. They had the spies in prisons, they had spies in seminaries, courts of Europe, all over the place. They had their spies. And people were encouraged to spy on each other. It was all part of the culture at the time. So people noticed on Candlemas, February the 2nd, 1591, that there were a lot of people going to her house. And what it was, she was having a mass said there. So the word got to the authorities, they raided the place. The priest managed to escape, Father Francis Page, but she was caught. There was an altar there, all laid out, vestments all ready, and I suppose we said she was caught red-handed. She had no excuse. So she was then taken to Tyburn several weeks later, and she was hanged at Tyburn. This is a person we all know, John Houghton, the prior of Charterhouse. Charterhouse was just a few minutes from St. Etheldreda's. I won't say much about it because you should be fairly familiar. Him as a Carthusian, the first English martyr. Now Edmund Jennings. He was a convert. He came down to London, and he actually had his lodgings with a family of recusants. The head of the family, Mr. Sherwood, had died in prison. The wife, Mrs. Sherwood, she had gone to prison. They had 3 sons. All these sons became priests. All these sons became priests. But he was caught very, very sadly. He was out in London, and it's a tragic tale really. He was looking for his family. He'd gone to Rome, gone to Europe, become a priest, come back, and he wanted to find his family. However, he didn't. His family had died. His mother and brother were dead, but he had a brother still alive, and he managed to find his brother, much to his great joy, until he found that his brother was fiercely anti-Catholic. His brother wanted nothing to do with him. So he met this other priest. It was a lovely name. This a priest called Polydore Plasden. Not a name you come across every day. But Edward Jennings knew him from the seminary, and they arranged to meet together and say mass together in a house in Gray's Inn, which was owned by the next guy we will see. That's Edward Jennings' younger one, because Edward Jennings, by the way, was the youngest of the English martyrs of England and Wales. He was the youngest. But they had arranged to say mass in the house of this guy, Swithin Wells. Swithin Wells was a teacher. He came from Hampshire. He was always involved in Catholic activism, and it was in his house that these 2 priests were going to say mass. So the next day they met, and they started saying mass when the priest hunters arrived. One of the main priest hunters, a real sadist of a man, was called Sir Richard Topcliffe. He was a terrible, terrible man, a sadist. He even had a torture chamber in his own house in Westminster, a rank. Anyway, the priest raiders raided the house while they were saying mass, and there was a bit of an unseemly scuffle went on, because the people at mass wouldn't open the door. People outside were trying to push the door in, and it was arranged that the Catholic people saying the mass, and at mass the Catholics would be allowed to finish the mass, but after that they had to hand themselves over to the priest hunters. So now the thing about Swithin Wells, he wasn't there. He wasn't there at the time. He was away. But because he was the owner of the house, he was held responsible. And so therefore he was condemned, and with Jennings, and they built a scaffold outside his house, and the 2 of them were on the scaffold. They'd never met before in their lives. Never met before. The only time they met was on the scaffold. And Swithin Wells had to watch while Jennings was hung, drawn and quartered, and then he was hanged himself. This is how it all went. This is Margaret Ward. All these saints are in St. Ethel readers. All in St. Ethel readers. She was the woman who, with John Roach, tried to help a priest that she found out about in Bridewell prison. He was physically, and he'd lost it mentally as well, apparently. And she was caught, dragged back to Bridewell, manacled to the walls there, and then she was flogged. And then she was taken to Tyburn, and she was hung. Women were never hung, drawn and quartered. It was just too much to treat a woman that way. Women were hanged. And that was Margaret. That was Margaret Ward. She's known as the Pearl of Tyburn, because that's where she was executed. Now, this man, for an obvious reason, some martyrs stand out more than the others, and this guy is one of them. He's called John Forrest. He was a Franciscan. He was the spiritual director and confessor to Catherine of Aragon. And naturally, he was very opposed to her marriage with Anne Boleyn, and he spoke out quite loudly and vociferously about it. He was thrown into prison, but continued as much as he could, making a nuisance of himself. And then there were two bishops, Thomas Cranmer and Hugh Latimer, decided that they would make an example of him if they could. Now, so they formed their own court. They produced a court. They sat in judgment over him. But because they were bishops, they couldn't charge him with high treason. because he denied the fact that Henry VIII was the Supreme Church of England, they could charge him with heresy, because it was a church court. So he was charged with heresy, and the punishment for heresy was burnt at the stake. So he was dragged and he was taken to Smithfield one day, and he was made to wait about 2 hours while these bishops harangued and preached against him. Now what had happened, they built this huge fire. And what they did was, in the dissolution of the monastery several years ago, or before, in Wales, they'd come across this huge wooden Welsh statue. It took 6 men to carry it, and they placed it right on top of the fire. And then there are two things about this statue. It was said that if anybody made a donation to it, they would never suffer the fires of hell. And secondly, this statue was going to burn down a forest. The pun was not lost on them. John Forest, a forest. So what they did was, they put this huge wooden statue on top of the fire, and they then hung John Forest in chains over the fire and set it alight. And he slowly roasted to death. According to records, it took him about 2 hours to die, and about 10,000 people turned up to watch the spectacle. These are all in St Etheldreda's. It's a magnificent place to go to. Magnificent. Grim, but magnificent. Now, the only part of the palace that we know of that survived was the chapel. But there was one other place. And this is, as a taxi driver, I can tell you that this is the hardest pub to find in London. Right? People can never find it. But if you go along Ely Place, you come across this little hole in the wall, so to speak. And then you come across this lovely little pub, a very old pub, called the Old Mitre. And this was part of the Bishop's Palace. It was the servants' quarters, and it became, in latter years, a pub. And really, in the corner there, you'll see a cherry tree. And apparently, Queen Elizabeth I danced around that cherry tree with one of her courtiers called Sir Richard Hatton, or Christopher Hatton rather, and who gave the name to Hatton Gardens, which is just by Ely Place. So, if you ever want to find a nice little pub away from everything, the Old Mitre is the place to go. And it does have a lot of history behind it. But moving on. Now, this may seem just an ordinary road junction, and in fact, most people would say it is. But in 1591, a priest called Christopher Bales was executed here. He lived on Fleet Street. Once again, like the guy before, he lived on Fleet Street. And they discovered who he was. They tricked him into admitting he was a Catholic priest. And they built the scaffold outside of his house. And there they hung, drew, and quartered him. However, it wasn't only him. There was another chap called Alexander Bales also. And he was a simple stable boy. Stable boy. But because he helped Christopher Bales, he was drawn along and executed as well. And he was executed at Gray's Inn. There was another one who was also executed because of this, called Nicholas Horner. Now, Nicholas Horner was a tailor. I'm saying to you this because we all think of the martyrs as being priests and holy men and everything. They were ordinary people like you and me. He was a tailor. And if you look at the back windows down there, you'll see him. There's a stained glass window of him, and it's distinctive because he had a wooden leg. He was caught doing some Catholic activities, and he was thrown into the Old Bailey, which was a real hellhole. And because they attached the manacles, the chains, so tightly, on his leg particularly, it got infected. You get an infection in one of those prisons, you might as well. That is it. And so 2 people held him down while they amputated his leg. And that's why you'll see he's got a wooden leg. But he came out, it didn't deter him, and he made a jacket for this priest, Christopher Bales. And because he did that, it was seen like almost like aiding and abetting an enemy or helping him. He was then hung himself in Smithfield, about 1592. But one of the things you will notice is that there's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there to commemorate what happened. Not a single sign at all. This is Charterhouse. This is where John Houghton was the prior of Charterhouse. And in the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, this house it wasn't destroyed, but it was altered. But it went to a man called the Duke of Norfolk. He comes across all the time in the Reformation history, the Duke of Norfolk. Now, the Duke of Norfolk was the father of Philip Howe. This is where Philip Howe spent his childhood. This is the gate. When John Houghton was actually executed and he was quartered, his arm was nailed to that gate, right across it, as a deterrent for the rest of the monks. Now, some of you may recognise this, but most people won't. This is Smithfield today. It's all in the process of changing. They're going to pull it down and build something else there. But this is Smithfield as it was today. This is Smithfield when it was a couple of 100 years ago. And this is where John Forrest was actually executed. You can imagine when all the animals were taken away, you had a great big space there. And that's where you could get thousands and thousands of people in there. But there was, not only was it a marketplace, it was a place of execution as well. In 1540, there were three priests executed there. Richard Featherstone, Anthony Abel, and Edward Powell. Those were 3, and they were executed. They were hung, drawn, and quartered there. But it doesn't end there. And it shows the confusion at the time, because at the same time as they were being executed, 3 Protestants were being executed. Henry VIII really thought he was a Catholic. He really believed he was a Catholic. The only thing he wouldn't do was accept the authority of the Pope. But in all other things like transubstantiation, everything like that, he believed it. And he physically persecuted the Protestants as well. Which, remember, it was very, very confusing for everybody. Very confusing. But there were three Protestants also. They weren't hung, drawn, and quartered because they were heretics. If you were a traitor, you were hung, drawn, and quartered. If you were a heretic, you were burnt at the stake. And that's what happened. Now, on that day, one of those Protestants, believe it or not, was somebody called Thomas Gerard. And he was the grandfather of John Gerard that we mentioned before. Now, as I said, you go on these sites and there is no sign of any of the Catholic martyrs, none at all. You'll find William Wallace there. Nice memorial to him. If you're Scottish, you'll probably be pleased about that. This one here, this is a stone in commemoration of the Protestant martyrs, burnt under Queen Mary, but nothing for the Catholics. Nothing at all. Now, Smithfield was a really interesting place. It was a high of activity. And here you can see Smithfield hangings, burnings and martyrdom. Okay, but there was in future years, allow me please, and a bit of levity here. People like heartedness. And we'll all sit back and go, we'll drive for this. Right? If you can see here, the wives' sale became popular in the early 19th century. Divorce was exceedingly difficult, and men brought their unwanted wives along with their normal goods to the meat market to sell them. Now, if you forget all the martyrs, you are not going to forget that. You admit it, you are not going to forget that. Just a bit of levity. Wake everybody up, come on. Right. This is a picture that should be familiar to everybody. We all can all immediately know what that is. That's St. Paul's Cathedral. But few of us will know that St. Paul's Cathedral was a place of execution. There were 3 martyrs who were, over the space of time, were executed there. And the place where they were executed was called St. Paul's Churchyard. In 1570, the Pope issued a bull, a papal bull called Regnans in Excelsis. And in that he officially excommunicated Elizabeth I. The English government retaliated by saying anybody caught with this papal bull will be considered an act of treason and they'll be punished accordingly. Now there was a fellow called John Felton, and he actually should have had one, he had 2 of these copies of the papal bull, and he went and he nailed one to the front door of the Bishop of London. Not the most astute of things to do, admittedly. And he got caught, and he was hung, drawn and quartered at St. Paul's Churchyard. He was beatified. However, at the time, and this is where things get quite interesting, the level of combinations and permutations is quite good. When he died, he had a 4-year-old son. Now, that 4-year-old son grew up and went abroad and became a Franciscan. But because of ill health, he came back to England. But he was still a Franciscan. And when the authorities found out about it, they nabbed him, put him in prison. And the year 1588 was a very important year. It was the year of the Spanish Armada. But in the wake of the Spanish Armada, there was a terrific Catholic backlash. In the few months after the Spanish Armada, it must have been about 30-odd Catholics were killed, martyred. They put up scaffolds all over London, and they were martyred. And his son, Thomas Felton, was martyred in Hounslow in 1588 because he was a Franciscan priest. Oh, anybody ever been here? It's the Old Bailey. Now the Old Bailey, its predecessor was called Newgate Prison, and it was a terrible place to go. There was a place in Newgate Prison called Limbo, and it was more or less like a pit, deep down no light, no windows, nothing. An open sewer running through it, and people were thrown down there. If you got, as I said, if you got infection, you were finished. But it was also an interesting place because a lot of people went to the Old Bailey. People like Ben Jonson, the playwright, Daniel Defoe, who wrote books, Titus Oates went there. And one of the perhaps the most famous ones who went there was a chap called Giacomo Casanova. And he was there, and I'm not making this up, on a charge of bigamy. He went there, yes. And also, it was a lot of martyrs passed through the Old Bailey on their way. But the reason I put it in this presentation is because there was in 1537, this was 2 years after John Houghton had died, Henry VIII sent his people to Charterhouse, and they hauled out 10 monks. And they took them to Newgate Prison, and they hung them up from the ceiling so that their feet were just touching the ground, and they left them there to starve to death. They were not allowed food or drink. But there was somebody who actually, it's amazing how God sent these people along, called Margaret Clements. Now Margaret Clements was the daughter, or the adopted daughter of Thomas More. And she would go and visit them and help them as much as feed them, clean them, everything. Because when you hung up for clinic for days and days and days, I leave that to your imagination. But she went along and she helped them as much as she possibly could. However, after a while, people were wondering why these monks were dying. Well, they were officially not being fed or being watered, and yet they seemed to be all right. So they realised why this was happening, and so she was banned from coming. She did try apparently to get onto the roof and feed them through a roof and everything, but they couldn't move. She had to have a real good aid to get it into their mouths or whatever from the roof. And slowly and surely they all died, except one. How he did this, I just don't know. But he still lived for a couple of months later. And so what they did was they sort of left him, threw him into the cells, and then in 1540 he was taken to Tyburn and he was hung, drawn and quartered. And that is nobody thinks there's nothing there to commemorate something like that. Those 10 Carthusian monks who were left to die terribly. This is the sort of place it was. It was a terrible place. This was one of the pictures of the prison, Newgate Prison, and it was demolished in 1777. Public executions at Tyburn finished in 1783. They were then moved to Newgate, and all the executions, public executions, took place at Newgate until 1823, and after that, all public executions took place inside the prison. Now, opposite Newgate Prison is a church, and it's called St. Sepulchre's. And it used to, well, it still is, it was the place where the martyrs' walks often took place. They started at St. Sepulchre's, all the way along Holborn, along through Oxford Street to Marble Arch, and to here. But in St. Sepulchre's, you'll find a bell. And there was a passageway from St. Sepulchre's to Newgate Prison. And at midnight, that bell was taken by what we call the bellman, and it was rung outside the of the cells of anybody who was to be hanged or executed that day. And with that bell, there was a little verse. And it said, "All you that in the condemned hole do lie, prepare you, for tomorrow you shall die. Watch all and pray, the hour is drawing near, that you before the Almighty must appear. Examine well yourselves, in time repent, that you may not to eternal flames be sent. And when St. Sepulchre's bell tomorrow tolls, the Lord above have mercy on your souls." That was chanted outside the cells of all those who were to be executed that day, and it will well have been recited outside the cells of some of the martyrs. Right, moving on now. We're moving on now to Tower Hill. Everyone knows Tower Hill, near the Tower of London. Once again, it was a place of execution. We know that if you look there, you'll find Thomas More, John Fisher. But you'll also find Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, the brother of Margaret Pole. He was executed on Tower Hill. And if you look here, you'll see here Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk. Well, he was the father, as I've said, of Philip Howard. He was executed in 1572. The Duke of Norfolk, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, was a very ambitious man. He loved power. He loved it. He was married twice. After his first marriage, he had 3 sons. So he married the widow of the Count of Arundel, and she had 3 daughters. And I'll give you one guess what he arranged. Yes, the 3 daughters and the 3 sons got married. And Philip Howard married a lady who was one of these daughters, called Anne Dacre. And it was actually Anne Dacre, we mentioned Anne Lyne before, who, when Anne Lyne was hung, buried in a pit, with some friends, she went out and dug up the body and buried it, but we don't know where. We don't know where. So that was the 4th Duke of Norfolk. He was executed for treason in 1572, beheaded on Tower Hill. Now, if you look across from Tower Hill, you come to the Tower of London. Now, many martyrs passed through the Tower of London, but very few were actually executed there. We talked about Margaret Pole. She was executed brutally in the Tower of London in 1541. And the executioner who did it was a very inexperienced man. And what he did was, he literally hacked her head off from her shoulders. It was a very inexperienced, and that was how she actually died. She was happy. But, as I said, only there was Margaret Pole died in there, executed. Philip Howard died there of dysentery. He was there for 10 years, and the very interesting thing about Philip Howard, he was a great friend of the Queen. She loved him. The Queen Elizabeth absolutely loved him. He was the apple of her eye for several years. And he attended court quite a lot. And as a result of this, he spent less and less time with his wife. And the Elizabethan court, I can assure you, was no place of virtue. And the two became rather distant, Philip Howard and his wife, Anne Dacre. However, when Philip Howard attended the disputations with Edmund Campion, it struck a nerve. He suddenly started feeling if he was to live his faith as he should do, he can't stay in England. He cannot stay in England. Anyway, before he left, a year or two before that, his wife had a baby, and they called it Elizabeth after the Queen. He still had a lot of time and respect for the Queen. But he decided to make a run for it, and he got into a boat and was halfway across the channel when he was stopped by an English ship, boarded and brought back to this country. It was 1885, and he spent 1585, and he spent the next 10 years in the Tower of London, and he eventually died there. Now, before he died, he actually sent a plea to Queen Elizabeth saying, "Can I please see my wife and my son?" Because when he was caught, his wife was pregnant. She didn't go with him abroad because she was pregnant. It was too dangerous, so she stayed at home. And he wanted to see his son. And Queen Elizabeth came back and said, "You can see them only if you recant your faith." He never saw his wife and son. Never saw them. He died there from dysentery. Also, somebody else who died in that Tower of London was a chap called Nicholas Owen. Now, this was a craftsman, and I discovered that recently that he was the patron saint of illusionists. The patron saint of illusionists, because I'm just getting hand signals here, and I'm getting vibes from everywhere. Mother Nicholas here, who we saw earlier, she is named after Saint Nicholas Owen. He was taken to the tower. Now they knew who this guy was. They knew that he'd built all these hiding holes for priests, but they didn't know exactly where or how many or whatever. And so he was tortured. He was tortured to death. He was tortured so much his stomach erupted and his entrails fell out. He died a terrible death. But only Margaret Pole, Philip Howard, and Nicholas Owen were the only three actually Catholics to die in the Tower of London. Right, this is an interesting one. Clink Prison. This was the prison for Catholics. There are a lot of Catholics in all the prisons throughout the country, but this one has a reputation as being the Catholic prison. And what would happen was that because the Catholics had the run of the place, if they paid the money, they could do anything. If they paid, they could come out during the day, come back at night, anything. And what would happen when the priests were in there? People would come, pay the doorman some money, they would go in and have their confessions, have confessions. That's true. They paid the doorman some money, and then they'd go in and confess their sins. And they also had mass inside there, mass inside the Clink Street prison. It's a place where, if you want to get a feel of the suffering that these people endured, that is quite a good place to go. It was not, a pretty place. Seeing those heads there reminds me of something which I'll tell you about. Because it's surprising when you study these places. Suddenly you come across an event, a story, and you say to yourself, "Wow, how could that happen?" And inside that prison, you will see one of the prisoners there was a chap called John Lowe, and he was a priest. And he was executed at Tyburn, and as is the custom, his head was then impaled on London Bridge. Now, as I said to you before, London Bridge was not your normal bridge, a road going through it. It was a thoroughfare. Businesses, houses, stores, the lot. But on London Bridge lived his mother. And every day she would have seen the impaled head of her son on London Bridge. And it makes you think that often there's more to martyrdom than simply dying. There's more to it than that. And it's stories like that expand your mind further. And there's a religious side to it. There's a section on the religions at the time in the King Street prison. A terrible place. Right. Now, we're back to the pubs. This is the hung, drawn and quartered. Now, the funny thing is about this pub, it's at Tower Hill. The funny thing is I could not make out why it was there. Is because nobody was ever hung, drawn and quartered on Tower Hill. Nobody. But it's probably a concept that was so ingrained in the English psyche, they had to name a pub after it. Right? So the hung, drawn and quartered. And you will see outside there this lovely quote by Samuel Pepys. I went to see Major General Harrison, hung, drawn and quartered. He was looking as cheerful as any man could in that condition. Now, Major Harrison was one of the signatories on the death warrant of King Charles. I went to King Charles II. And when King Charles II came to England for the Restoration, he started hunting down all those who signed his father's death warrant. And it got to such an extreme that the most weird execution took place at Tyburn in 1660. And it was strange because the people who were hanged were already dead. They'd been dead for a couple of years. But what Charles II had done, so passionately did he feel about all this, he dug up Oliver Cromwell, John Bradshaw, his son-in-law, and General Ireton, and hanged them all at Tyburn. It's true, it's absolutely weird. Absolutely weird. Now, okay, it's all fuzzy, we'll get that in a minute. I've said to you, there are two places in London where there's a public acknowledgement of the Tyburn martyrs, the 105 Catholic martyrs. Now, if you go to this place, if you look down here, this is the strategic area down here. If you actually zoom in on that, this is what you find in the pub. In hung, drawn and quartered. And whoever placed it in that pub, it was a masterclass of marketing. Because it actually placed it in the most visited place in the pub. And that's not the bar. You will find this next to the ladies' toilet. That's where it is. But you've heard it from me. Okay? But we are all more familiar with this one. Yeah. Okay? And that brings an end to my presentation this evening.
Before everyone goes, Tom, what an amazing talk. I mean, really, thank you so much. General and all the sisters here who graciously allowed us to use this sacred space to have this talk about the martyrs. If you're interested in Tom's tours, speak to him at tea time because he does take people around to all these sites that you've seen today that he's been thinking about. He also mentioned a card, a laminated card that he's had prepared for each one of you. Jackie at the corner in the back will be giving that out, so make sure you get one on your way out to help you remember and learn about these martyrs, as Tom very eloquently said. Right, so we also have future talks. We've got 2 more, as I mentioned to you in the start. This is the second of 4 talks. Talk 3 will be on the 16th of September. The venue is yet to be confirmed. And our last talk will be December 1st at the Brompton Oratory. So if we do not have your email address, when you are going to make sure that you go over, someone will have that walking around to give us your email so we can update you and confirm times, dates, places for the next talks. And lastly, I think is just to remind you, those of you who would like to give a donation to the sisters, there is a collection at the back, and also if you want to do so digitally, at the top of the stair, there is a machine there for you. And I want to thank you for coming today, and I hope you enjoyed our talk.